The story of the lost battalion of Norfolk doesn't begin in the searing heat of Turkey, but beneath the ancient oaks of Sandringham in the county of Norfolk. To understand their disappearance, we must first understand who these men were. In 1914, England was breathing the last gasps of the Edwardian era, a time of rigid hierarchies held together by an almost medieval sense of loyalty. At the heart of this world lay the Sandringham estate, the private sanctuary of King George V. Here, the relationship between master and servant was intimate. The men who would form the famous Sandringham Company, E Company, were not mere numbers in a military system. They were the gardeners who tended the Queen's roses, the gamekeepers who knew every inch of the King's forests, and the grooms who prepared the royal mounts. When war was declared, King George V made an unprecedented decision. He allowed his men to form their own unit. They were to be the King's own battalion. Recruitment in Norfolk was marked by a patriotic fervour tinged with a tragic innocence. In the villages of Sandringham and Wolferton, the call to arms was seen as an extension of domestic duty. If the King needed them, they would go. But there was a darker structural element at play: the PALS battalions. The British government encouraged friends, neighbours and co-workers to enlist together. The idea was that men would fight harder alongside those they loved. What no one foresaw was that this strategy meant that if a unit was decimated, entire villages would lose every single one of their young men in a single afternoon. At the helm of this company was Frank Beck, the estate manager of the royal lands. At 54 years old, Beck was a man of silver hair and steady eyes, a paternal figure beloved by everyone on the estate. He had no obligation to fight. His age and position granted him immunity. However, he refused to watch his boys depart without him. His loyalty was absolute. He would care for them on the battlefield, just as he had cared for them at Sandringham. This decision, heroic on paper, would become the center of a deeply personal tragedy for the royal family. The training was a period of painful transition. Men who had spent their lives handling pruning shears and plows were now trying to master the Lee-Enfield rifle and the 17-inch bayonet. The contrast was jarring. The pastoral scenery of the English countryside served as a backdrop for trench raids and forced marches. In July 1915, the order to embark finally arrived. The departure was a spectacle of national pride. Thousands crowded the docks to see the RMS Aquitania, a luxury liner converted into a troopship. The sheer scale of the ship, with its 4 towering funnels, was a symbol of Britain's industrial might. But inside, the atmosphere was claustrophobic. The Norfolk men were crammed into lower decks, where the air was thick with the smell of sweat, tobacco, and engine oil. For many of these country folk, it was their first time seeing the sea. They were sailing away from everything they knew, toward a destination that the maps of the time could barely detail. As the ship crossed the Mediterranean, the reality of war began to seep in. Reports of wounded men returning from the front spoke of a new kind of horror in a place called Gallipoli. The British strategy, championed by a young Winston Churchill, was ambitious: an amphibious landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula to force a passage through the Dardanelles, capture Constantinople, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. It was a brilliant plan on paper, but a nightmare in execution. When the men of the 1/5 Norfolk finally sighted the coast of Suvla Bay in August 1915, the shock was physical. The air was not just hot, it was scorching, heavy with the smell of decay and the incessant buzzing of billions of flies feeding on the dead on the beaches. The terrain was not soft grass, but a dry, brittle earth infested with thorny shrubs that tore at their uniforms. When the men of the 1/5 Norfolk finally sighted the coast of Suvla Bay in August 1915, the shock was physical. The air was not just hot, it was scorching, heavy with the smell of decay and the incessant buzzing of billions of flies feeding on the dead on the beaches. The terrain was not soft grass, but a dry, brittle earth infested with thorny shrubs that tore at their uniforms. The landing at Suvla Bay on the night of August 6, 1915, was supposed to be the masterstroke that would end the Ottoman Empire's resistance. Instead, it became one of the most catastrophic failures in British military history. While the soldiers, including the 1/5th Norfolk, struggled to establish a bridgehead on the beaches, the British High Command, led by General Sir Frederick Stopford, remained paralyzed. Stopford, a 61-year-old general who had never commanded troops in active combat, chose excessive caution while his men died under the unrelenting sun. The scenery was dantesque. Suvla Bay was dominated by a vast, dry salt lake, a blinding white plain that reflected the sun like a mirror of fire. Surrounding it, steep hills infested with dry scrub concealed Turkish snipers, known for their lethal precision and impeccable camouflage. The British held the numerical advantage, but the command's inertia gave the Ottomans the precious time needed to reinforce the mountain ridges. What was meant to be a swift race to the heights turned into a static siege in 100-degree heat. Before the first direct confrontation, the Norfolk Battalion faced a far more cruel enemy: thirst. British logistics had completely collapsed. Water barges ran aground on reefs, and the region's few wells were either poisoned or under constant fire. Survivor accounts describe men with tongues so swollen they could not close their mouths. Many, in a state of heat-induced delirium, attempted to drink the salt water of the sea, sealing their fate in fits of madness and terminal dehydration. Frank Beck and his King's men were beyond exhausted. They hadn't slept properly in days, and dysentery was tearing through the ranks. Yet their sense of duty to Sandringham kept them standing. They were not just soldiers, they were a community in arms. But this very esprit de corps, which should have been their strength, was about to become their greatest tragedy, for it would prevent them from retreating when common sense dictated otherwise. On the morning of August 12, 1915, the 163rd Brigade received orders to advance and capture a line of hills known as Teke Tepe, clearing the way for a larger push the following day. The 1/5th Norfolk, under the command of Colonel Sir Horace Beauchamp, was positioned on the right flank of the attack. Beauchamp was the polar opposite of Stopford, an impetuous, aggressive cavalry veteran who loathed hesitation. The attack began at 4 in the afternoon, a brutal tactical error. The low-hanging sun shone directly into the eyes of the British, while the Turkish defenders had a crystal-clear view of every man moving across the plain. The plan called for a coordinated advance with artillery support, but communication failed. The British bombardment was short and imprecise, hitting empty ground while the Ottoman machine guns waited in absolute silence. When the signal was given, Beauchamp did not hesitate. He unsheathed his sword and ordered the charge. As the Norfolks advanced, the chaos of battle began to fragment the brigade. While other units were pinned down by devastating crossfire and chose to take cover in craters, Beauchamp and his roughly 250 men, including the royal elite of Sandringham and Captain Frank Beck, kept moving forward. They seemed to ignore the casualties falling all around them. Driven by the colonel's battle cry, they broke through the first Turkish defensive line and continued charging toward a densely wooded area at the base of the hills. It was at this moment that something strange was noticed by observers in the rear. A dense and unusual mist, described as strangely solid and grayish in color, began to descend from the hills, despite the day being clear and windless. To the soldiers watching from a distance, it appeared as though Beauchamp and his men were marching directly into a wall of smoke or fog. They were separating themselves from the rest of the army, isolating themselves in a territory where no support could reach them. Captain Frank Beck was last seen helping a wounded soldier as the battalion entered the thick vegetation. Witnesses claim he was calm, coordinating his boys with the same quiet authority he had displayed in the gardens of Norfolk. But the terrain ahead was a labyrinth of ravines and scrub that the Turks knew like the back of their hand. As the last man of the 1/5 Norfolk disappeared into the trees and the mist, the sound of the fighting began to change. The rifle shots became muffled, distant, as if they were occurring in another dimension. There were no cries for retreat, no flares requesting reinforcements. There was only an oppressive silence that descended over the forest. On that afternoon of August 12th, 250 men from King George V's royal estate marched into the heart of the enemy empire, and from that second on, history stopped recording their footsteps. What happened inside that mist would become the best-kept secret of Gallipoli. In the early hours of August 13th, 1915, the headquarters of the 163rd Brigade waited for the return of the scouts. The expectation was that Colonel Beauchamp and his men had spent the night entrenched in some strategic ravine after their impetuous advance. But as the sun rose over the Gallipoli horizon, reality began to draw itself in somber colors. There was no sign of smoke, no mirror signals, and most disturbing of all, no sound of combat coming from the direction where the battalion had vanished. Search patrols were sent out with caution, but what they found was a desert of answers. Where 250 men had marched with fixed bayonets only hours before, there was now only arid terrain and the whistling hot wind. There were no mass of bodies, no piles of spent cartridges to indicate a heroic last stand. It was as if the ground had opened and swallowed the Sandringham elite. General Sir Ian Hamilton, Commander-in-Chief of the Expeditionary Force, recorded in his official diary a sentence that would echo for decades. They got lost in the forest and were never seen or heard from again. While the British Army struggled to grasp what had occurred at Suvla Bay, the news crossed the oceans. When the official telegram reached the Sandringham estate, time seemed to stand still. King George V and Queen Mary were informed that their personal company was missing in action. In Norfolk, the atmosphere of patriotic pride evaporated, replaced by a silent, paralyzing grief. Unlike other units, where losses were distributed across various regions, the Sandringham Company was a family. Almost every house on the royal estate had a son, husband, or brother in that battalion. Queen Mary, personally connected to the families, began writing letters by hand, trying to offer a comfort she herself did not possess. Captain Frank Beck, the moral anchor of the community, had left a void that no one could fill. Sandringham became a village of widows and orphans, all united by a question that the British government could not answer. Where are they? The first logical theory was that the battalion had been surrounded and captured en masse by the Turks. During World War I, it was common for large units to surrender when isolated. However, through neutral diplomatic channels and the Red Cross, the British government pressured the Ottoman Empire for information. Constantinople's response was short and baffling. They had no record of any prisoners from the 1/5 Norfolk captured on August 12th. The Turks were known to be brutal fighters, but generally proud of their victories. Had they annihilated or captured the personal guard of the King of England, it would have been used as massive war propaganda. But the Ottoman generals remained silent. To them, the British advance that afternoon had been repelled, but there were no reports of a mass surrender. The Norfolk Battalion was not in the prisoner camps of Anatolia, nor was it on the lists of identified dead. They had simply ceased to exist in the human record. Months turned into years. The Gallipoli Campaign was finally abandoned by the Allies in 1916 in a humiliating retreat. As the last ships left the Turkish coast, the families in Norfolk realized that the chance of a miraculous return was closing. Uncertainty is a form of psychological torture worse than confirmed grief. With no bodies to bury and no graves to visit, legends began to emerge. Rumors that the men had been taken deep into the interior of Turkey or executed in secret circulated through the pubs of Norfolk. But there was another type of account, whispered only among veterans who were there that afternoon. They spoke of the mist. They spoke of how the sky seemed different on August 12th. The mystery that began as a tactical error was starting to take on contours that challenged military reality. The lost battalion was no longer just a statistical loss. It was becoming an open wound in the heart of the British monarchy, an anomaly that King George V vowed to investigate as soon as peace was signed. The search for the king's men was only beginning, and what would be found years later at the end of the war would be more disturbing than the disappearance itself. With the armistice of 1918, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the Gallipoli Peninsula, once an inaccessible stronghold, was finally opened to British investigators. King George V, who never forgot his Sandringham boys, ordered an exhaustive search for answers. In 1919, Reverend Charles Pierre Point Edwards, a military chaplain tasked with locating war graves, arrived at Suvla Bay. What he found was not a miracle, but a scene that looked like a nightmare, frozen in time. In an isolated farmstead located exactly behind the lines, where Colonel Beauchamp and his men were last seen, Edwards discovered a mass grave. The Reverend's account is both detailed and disturbing. He described hundreds of bodies scattered across a small area, many still wearing the tattered remains of their Norfolk uniforms. What stood out most was the state of the remains. The bodies were piled together, suggesting they didn't die in a combat formation, but were dumped there after a swift, brutal catastrophe. Through belt buckles and metal badges bearing the Norfolk insignia, 122 men were identified. Among them, the fate of Frank Beck seemed sealed, but instead of closing the mystery, this discovery only opened new and more terrifying questions. The owner of the Turkish farm, a local peasant, told British investigators that days after the battle on August 12, 1915, he found the field covered in disfigured British bodies. According to him, the bodies looked as if they had been dropped from a considerable height or massacred in an impossibly short amount of time. However, Turkish military records remained devoid of any mention of a large-scale confrontation at that specific farm. If there was a massacre, why was there no resistance? Where were the spent ammunition casings? Where were the Turkish dead that should have fallen in a fight against 250 elite troops? The 1919 discovery suggested a tragic earthly end, but the lack of evidence of a conventional battle kept the element of the strange hovering over the story. It was then that, decades later, the case took a turn that would place it in the pantheon of the 20th century's greatest mysteries. 50 years after the disappearance, during the anniversary celebrations of the Gallipoli Campaign, 3 New Zealand veterans, Frederick Reichart, R. Nunes, and J.L. Newman, decided they could no longer keep what they had seen to themselves. They were part of an engineering unit occupying a high ridge, with a perfect view of the valley on that fateful August 12th. Their testimony was signed and sworn, and what they described was no ordinary mist. They claimed to have seen 6 or 8 loaf-shaped clouds, all identical, hovering just above the ground. Despite a strong southerly wind, these clouds remained perfectly still, as if anchored by something invisible. Below them, on the ground, was an even larger cloud, described as a solid greyish structure measuring about 800 feet in length. The New Zealanders watched in disbelief as the 1/5th Norfolk Battalion marched in absolute silence directly into this dense cloud. They expected to see the men emerge on the other side to storm the Turkish trenches, but no one ever came out. The account becomes even more disturbing at its climax. According to the veterans, as soon as the last British soldier disappeared into the greyish mass, the cloud lifted off the ground silently. It rose until it joined the other smaller clouds, hovering in the sky, and together they all moved against the wind toward the north, vanishing within minutes. The valley was suddenly empty. This testimony, corroborated by 22 other soldiers who were on the same ridge, transformed the lost battalion into a phenomenon that is now frequently cited in studies of time anomalies or even mass abduction theories. For skeptics, the New Zealanders might have suffered an optical illusion caused by extreme heat and the stress of combat. But for the families back in Norfolk, the account brought a new kind of horror. The possibility that their loved ones hadn't just died, but had been snatched from reality itself. The documentary now faces its greatest shock: how to reconcile the bodies found in 1919 with the cloud seen in 1965. Was the cloud a rare meteorological phenomenon that concealed a Turkish massacre so rapid that not a single soldier managed to fire back? Or were the bodies found at the farm only part of the battalion, while the rest truly vanished without a trace? Modern meteorological science speaks of lenticular clouds, which can appear static and solid under certain conditions. But war veterans do not usually confuse weather with the impossible. The Norfolk mystery lies exactly in that vacuum. Between the bones found in the Turkish soil and the clouds that rose into the sky, there is a truth that the British government preferred to keep filed away under the label of war casualties. But for those who study the echoes of the front lines, the mist of August 12, 1915 has yet to clear. For official history, the case of the 1/5th Norfolk Battalion was closed with Reverend Edwards' discovery in 1919. The version accepted by the British War Office is that the battalion, in its aggressive momentum, overextended itself, was surrounded by superior Turkish forces, and was annihilated in a brutal massacre at Kayak Kuyu Farm. The bodies found would be the definitive proof of a tragic yet purely military end. However, for independent investigators and mystery enthusiasts, the numbers tell a different story. Out of the 250 men who marched into the woods with Colonel Beauchamp, only 122 were recovered from the mass grave. What happened to the other 128 soldiers? Where were the high-ranking officers whose bodies were never identified? If the massacre was total, why does half the battalion seem to have evaporated, without leaving even a bone fragment or a metal badge in the Turkish soil? The paradox between the mass grave and the 1965 account of the mist remains the radioactive core of this mystery. One of the most intriguing theories suggests that the British government and Buckingham Palace may have allowed the legend of the supernatural mist to grow to cover a much more shameful reality. Unconfirmed reports suggest the King's men may have been captured and summarily executed by the Turks, a war crime that, if revealed at the time, would have demanded a level of retaliation that could have prolonged the conflict or destabilized peace negotiations. For King George V, the idea that his personal friends and servants were taken to the heavens by a divine cloud or an inexplicable phenomenon was perhaps more bearable than the image of them being executed in a dirty ditch in Anatolia. The mystery served as an anesthetic for a nation's pain. By transforming dead soldiers into vanished ghosts, the Crown preserved the mystique of the Sandringham Company, elevating them from victims of a tactical blunder to protagonists of an eternal myth. While historians debate, the real impact on Norfolk was devastating and permanent. Sandringham was never the same again. The royal estate, which once vibrated with the energy of hundreds of young workers, became a place of silence and memory. Queen Mary kept the rooms of some of the soldiers exactly as they were, waiting for a return that she, deep down, knew was impossible. The grief in Norfolk was collective. Because the unit was made up of friends and relatives, the loss of one meant the pain of all. For decades, in local pubs and church meetings, the fate of the 1/5 Norfolk was the only forbidden subject, and at the same time, the only thing everyone thought about. They became the echoes of the front lines for Norfolk, voices whispering in the wind that blew from the North Sea, reminding everyone that war doesn't just take lives, it can erase entire existences. Modern meteorology attempts to explain the New Zealanders' account as a combination of lenticular clouds and fata morgana, a complex mirage caused by thermal inversion that can make objects appear to float or disappear. On a day of extreme heat, after days of exhausting combat, the human mind is capable of projecting its fears and hopes onto the sky. But this explanation fails to account for the precision of the sworn testimony of 22 different soldiers, all describing the same solid structure and the same movement against the wind. If it was an illusion, it was a collective illusion on an unprecedented scale in military history. The Norfolk Battalion remains on the border between documented fact and modern folklore, a reminder that even in the age of technology and reason, the battlefield remains a place where the impossible can happen. Today, a simple memorial in the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in Sandringham bears the names of those who never returned. Colonel Beauchamp, Captain Frank Beck, and their boys have no individual graves. They belong to the mist of Gallipoli. The story of the Lost Battalion is a documentary about loyalty taken to the extreme, about the arrogance of command, and about the mystery that is born when reality breaks. They marched out of history and into eternity. Whether they were victims of a Turkish massacre hidden by time, or whether they truly crossed a rift in reality within a greyish cloud, we may never know. What we do know is that on August 12, 1915, the King of England lost his best men, and the world gained a mystery that, 100 years later, still makes us look at the sky with a hint of uncertainty. In Gallipoli, the ashes mixed with the sand, but the Norfolks, they keep marching invisible through the echoes of history.